Hello, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm also known as Fleb. I'd like to start today with a little quote. I don't know what I'm doing, but my incompetence has never stopped my enthusiasm. Which I would like to paraphrase as, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Yet, somehow, despite that, I made this game, which is right here. It used a lot of things that I know. It used even more things that I don't know. And what this talk is going to be about today is how you can sort of figure out the things that you don't know and do just enough to get this working. So who am I? I'm a YouTuber, sort of. I uploaded a bunch of videos to YouTube about 2 years ago, and I haven't done much since then. But I'm hoping to get back into it. I'm a professional electrical engineer. I work on medical devices. And I'm a puzzle designer. I've done puzzle consulting for Hollywood and a bunch of other places as well. So what I ended up building was this. It's a very niche puzzle game. And hopefully that shows up there. Yep. So there's a dial at the top that chooses each of 16 television channels, and a dial at the bottom that controls what happens in each of those channels. This is fully built by me. The whole box, the software, I bought the screen, but I didn't build that. But this is a whole project from start to finish. Each of these is a puzzle that leads to a 5 or 6 letter word or code word. And that's where the name comes from, Extra Reality Codebreaker. So there's 16 puzzles. It's written in C++, and it uses Opengl. And in the all-control GDC competition held at the Game Developers Conference last year, it was one of the 6 finalists. So what's actually in this thing? Well, there's a Raspberry Pi that's running all the code. There's a screen module that does HDMI, so you plug HDMI into it. There are 2 different rotary encoders, which are what form the basis of these 2 dials. There's a Headphone Jack extender to extend the jack from the Raspberry Pi to out right here. There's a bunch of wire to hook it all together, and there's a bunch of wood. And not pictured is the immense amount of super glue that holds everything together. So this brings up a number of questions. When you're trying to make something like this from scratch, how do you design the game? How do you code the game? And how do you make the case? You may have thought you were seeing one talk, but this is actually 3 or 4 talks in one. Starting with, how do you start to design something like this? That, in turn, is a number of questions that it brings up. How do you get the idea for a puzzle game? How do you ensure that you can make the game? And then how do you end up designing the puzzles? Even more talks. So, how do you get the idea for a puzzle game? You might think, well, let's steal like an artist. But I'm going to take that one step further and say, let's steal from an artist. I knew when I started this that I wanted to make something that was very artistic, that was super niche, and that had some big ideas behind it. So one of the things that I started doing was just Googling different artists that have existed. And eventually I came across this quote that was something like, Donald Judd will be the only artist remembered from the 21st century. And if you're saying, who is Donald Judd? That was my question too. So I looked up this guy, and he makes stuff that looks kind of like this. It's super minimalist, just stuff that he's put into a room. Oftentimes it's colored, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just like a block of wood that he's put there. I was like, are you serious? Like, how is this guy the best artist of the 21st century? But I ended up reading a little article that he had written called Specific Objects. And in that article, he talks about how frames in art are this separation between the person who's viewing the art and the actual canvas. I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Because screens are the same way in video games. They separate the player world from the player. And in particular, I like this quote, anything on the surface has space behind it. 2 colors on the same surface almost always lie on different depths. Edgier seed excitement in this article. What this gave me the idea for was a game that could somehow bridge this boundary. A game where you would do a puzzle on the game, but it would have no idea how it would end. The end states wouldn't be there. However you would solve the puzzle wouldn't be inside the game world, but in the real world instead. That may sound confusing, but it led to these sort of design goals. Use the screen as that art frame. Make the end states outside of the game. That led me to do something called led me to design this with what is known as a puzzle hunt puzzle, which is essentially a puzzle that has an English word or phrase as an answer. With that, you could have the entire puzzle of finding that word inside the game, but then have to sort of assemble all the pieces of it outside. I knew at that point that I wanted to make it an actual screen like an analog television, and I needed something to select each puzzle and something to interact. So even at this point, where it's still pretty abstract, where I haven't written any code or designed any puzzles, so the vague idea about what this is already there. So that takes care of how you get the idea for a puzzle game. But still, how do you ensure that you can make the game? And then how do you design the puzzles? A long time ago, I made a game called Rib. This is perhaps the world's simplest game. All you have to do is hit one of those buttons to select a color, and then press one of the things over here. It's entirely buttons. The entire game is just buttons. All you have to be able to do is make a button, display a static image, and then move between those images. When you touch something, it would just, if you touched it correctly, it would change the image. This is sort of my approach to actually starting out in game design. I knew I couldn't make something complicated, but I could make something extremely simple. I can display an image, and most importantly, I can make a button. So when it came time to Texturality Codebreaker, which is the name of this game, I wanted to do something similarly easy. I know that I could make a button. I know that I could display static images. The one thing that's different about this than Rib is it has some moving pictures as well. So this new game would be a button plus some moving sprites instead of static images. Two outside controls, the ones that I mentioned before, one to select and one to actually interact. And then I would make a box to enclose it all. All of these things I think I can do. And then I'm pretty sure I can design puzzles. So I felt at this point that I had something that I could actually go with, that I could actually make in reality. The last question in this section is, how do you design the puzzles? So how do you design the puzzles? Like I said before, this is a puzzle hunt style, so it's something where all the information is on the game, and then you're getting to word. I'll show an example in just a minute. And then that answer would itself form a bigger puzzle. And it would only use that single dial as the input. So one example of this has disappeared from my talk. Here it is. Is this top puzzle here, the Great Race. So in this, what you're doing with the dial is you're moving a little circle around the line. And depending on when you finish relative to the green dots, different things happen. There I finished in second place, and so 2 different letters were revealed here on a grid. If you finished in first place, it would reveal a letter here, third place there, fourth there, fifth, all 5 of those letters there. If you took all of those and put them onto a grid, it looked kind of like this. Now here's the point at which, in a puzzle hunt puzzle, you need to be able to figure out how to extend what you've been doing to make something new. So what you've been doing is turning a little dial and moving a little dot around the line. You can take that line and overlay it on top of the grid. And when you do it, it spells out what is left. There are 5 squares that aren't hit by this line. If you take them from top to bottom, they spell enter. But this had all of the characteristics that I wanted from a puzzle. You turn a dial, you do an action, and you sort of repeat that action outside of the game. When you were following the line inside the game with the dial, you then follow it outside the game with your pen. There are a lot of examples of this inside of the box. And this was my general design philosophy for this. I'd start with an interaction that could be controlled with a dial. For example, moving a little dot around a path. That's an example of driving, so then you overlay that path on the grid. There's another puzzle that involves an oven. What you're doing is you're controlling a temperature to a small range. Controlling to that small range of temperature is taking a piece of something. And so it made sense to also have the answer to that be taking pieces of words. There's another puzzle that's a pendulum where you're going back and forth. And the puzzle is about figuring out that the words are actually palindromes, which read the same forwards and backwards. There's a puzzle that's in a theater where you animate a scene by turning a dial. It's about following the paths of those letters as you animate the scene in real life. There's one with a phone where you dial a rotary phone and you transcribe the results using a letter keypad code. And there's a very abstract one where you're taking one-dimensional slices of words. And then at the very end, what you're doing is stacking those into a two-dimensional tower. This takes a long time to design, but it's one way to get around this big problem of how do you go from nothing to an actual set of puzzles. So that covers all of those. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how I coded this game. Here's a quote: "Programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute." That didn't happen. It's really 2,000 magic numbers. So it's written in C++ and it uses Opengl and is absolutely a total disaster in terms of its actual coding. So how do you code a game and how do you learn Opengl? Well, in this game, there's a couple things you have to do. You need to read the top dial to change the puzzle. You need to be able to read the bottom dial to move inside of that puzzle. You need to be able to display images. You need to be able to write sound out over the headphones. And I didn't mention the screen here because the screen literally just plugs into the HDMI port. So you don't actually have to write any code to make the screen work. In general, I found that when designing things, the easier you can make any step in your process, just spend the money and do it. So coding libraries here are very much your friend, and they're how I managed to accomplish most of this project. There's something called Wiring Pi, which is used on the Raspberry Pi to read the different pins that you can plug in. That's very easy to use, and it was used to read the dials on this project. The dials, by the way, I haven't talked about too much yet. There are two different types of rotary encoders. And if you don't know what a rotary encoder is, neither did I. I typed into Google something like, what's the spinny thing that measures position? And was able to figure out that this was the term that I needed. I knew that there were the ones that go clicky and the ones that are smooth. And if you use enough of those words, you can find exactly what you need. So the top one is an absolute encoder. It's a clicky one. And it uses hard-coded positions. It has 4 different pins that come out, each of which is a binary digit. And that leads to 16 different possibilities for the output. There are 4 pins that then connect up to the microcontroller, and it reads all 4 of those. So that's where actually the 16 different puzzles come from. That number comes from the fact that I couldn't find an absolute encoder with 14 positions. The bottom one is a relative encoder. And instead of doing something where it just tells you its exact position, it tells you which direction it's moving and how fast it's going. You can see here, this right here is the absolute encoder, and that's the relative encoder. And there's the 4 digits plus power line. And then there's the 2 squares coming out here and also a power line there. Those then connected right up to the Raspberry Pi. And if you want to come see it, this lid actually comes straight off. So it's right there. So we need to read 4 pins for the top dial, and we need to read 2 pins for the bottom dial. I configured those as interrupts. It's basically just something in the code that whenever that changes, it looks for them. That took care of the dials, and so I moved right on to the headphone jack. Literally, that's just a headphone jack cord plugged into the headphone jack port of the Raspberry Pi. And I actually couldn't find a small one, so there's like 4 or 5 feet of headphone jack cord in here. And then there was another library that I found that was really good for outputting audio, which is surprisingly hard. It was the SDL mixer library. From there, the only things left to do in the game, essentially, are to make functions that display sprites. I made a variable for the time that had passed since the game started, and that allowed me to make moving sprites. Moving sprites, basically, you just put in some variable that's a function of the game time since it started. So this is what it looks like. This is really not best coding practice. You really don't want to have a bunch of random numbers inside of your code. But this game is essentially that times 1,000. You just manually put in the positions of all the different sprites. You read the 2 dials, and you make sure that whenever you're moving the dials, you move the sprites as well. Okay, so I did use Opengl for a little bit of this project. I used it to make the screen slightly curved. And this was a grand undertaking. It had to actually use the GPU to do the screen transformation, but the game would have worked without it. So when I first started, I said, I'll have a month to do this. If it doesn't work out, then I can still make the game. But if it does work out, then it'd be really cool. So for that, it was something that was brand new to me. But of course, just Googling learn OpenGL, there's a great website that just teaches you it. That's the wonderful thing about this world. Is there's so much stuff like this. And in particular, they had a great example of a 2D game that I was able to learn a lot from. Nothing too complicated, just exactly what I needed. Okay. The last thing is, how do I actually make the enclosure of this? So you might take a look at this picture and go, wow, that really looks a lot like that picture. When I was doing this, I went online to DIY websites, Instructables, there's a DIY Reddit, and I started looking for stuff that might be what I've wanted to build. And this was basically what I wanted to make, which was a panel that was inset inside of a frame. And so this guy had a great Imgur album where he just listed exactly what he did. He basically cut just little slits through a couple different wooden boards. And if that looks familiar, it's basically exactly what I did. The front panel wasn't that, but I had to actually cut the wood myself. For that, you need to be very careful because he used a table saw, as did I. And with a table saw, there's a possibility of kickback. And this is a little piece of wood that's embedded inside a garage door from kickback. So if you're going to do something with woodworking and a table saw, you really just can't sort of mess around with it like I did for the rest of this project. So I actually did end up taking a class. I found a local makerspace, and I took a class. That was at Artisans Asylum up in Boston. And that was enough that I could make this. It's just a bunch of rectangular pieces kind of glued together. It's not very good, but it works. And then for the front panel, that's made of this MDF material. It's actually laser cut. I just found a website called Pinoco. They do laser cut everything. I sent them this design over, and it came back just like that. So that's essentially how I made it, and I really rushed through the talk. I do have a couple of points of failures. I thought the game was too hard. It was too long. The code, of course, was awful, and the box was cut badly. Also, my wife doesn't know this, but I gave the first box to my daughter to see if she could, to see if it would survive infant stress testing. I don't have a picture of it because it did not. But even though all of these things were wrong about it, all of these things kind of failed, they were all just good enough. The box was just good enough to house the components. They barely fit in there. The code was just good enough to get stuff running on the screen. And in the end, I was able to take it to GDC and be a part of this really cool exhibition. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I advise that you use the internet and don't do what I did, that you ask people, Stack Exchange, Google Instructables. You make it simple where you can. And of course, I'm always available. Feel free to email me about anything.